Welcome to Starbound. My name's Bree and I will be your narrator today. Nearly 500 supporters get early access to our stories, including brand new episodes of Sunspire Academy and Frairen and Rimiki. If you'd like to unlock early access and support new episodes and future series, tap join below to become a Starbound member. Now let's get into today's story.
Frairen jumped awake to the blaring sound of the alarm on the battleship she called home, the Big Mouth Bass. Even in the large battle-tested ship, the alarm ripped through it like a banshee, undoubtedly shaking everyone on board awake. Frairen, as per her training, practically leapt out of bed to start changing into her service uniform. The alarms refused to ease up as she changed, and Sergeant Killjoy's voice cut through the intercoms. "Good morning, my little stargazers. Third Company, report to the hangar bay immediately." The message was short and sweet, everything the Third Company needed to know to get started on their way. Killjoy's voice disappeared with a sharp click of static and the ship's AI took over in repeating. Third Company, report to the hangar bay immediately for an emergency brief." "Do either of you want to hold a bet on what it could be this time?" Frairen barked over the alarm. The golden-furred beast-like Yorpul turned to her companions to see how they were doing. The cobra-like Zetrin and multicoloured knife-eared Himmel were also getting ready as quickly as possible. They were all trained in the same boot camp, after all, and they've all bled and fought together for a good while now. Instead of bumbling like idiots from the loud beeping and ringing in their ears, they disrobed and put on their service uniforms with practiced ease. Despite the hellish training they went through at the hands of humans, Frairen doesn't regret it. She'll even do it all again. Her fellow Yorpuls called her a werewolf, and it's something she found herself taking pride in. Her and her roommates were also all familiar with the sound of the alarms. The AI would be unbearably loud for anyone with sharp ears, like Frairen, until every single soul was accounted for. Any missing human or star citizen would be dragged to the hangar in their pajamas if necessary, and Frairen would rather not her or any of her companions be victims of that.
"Who knows?"
Zetrin hissed. His long neck curved towards his Yorpul friend, and she could see his scaly hood flexing slightly as his head moved. She almost swore that his lips were curling into a thin smile. His head drifted to look at Himmel after his jab. Frairen understood why he'd be smiling at that point.
"It could be anything, but I bet it has something to do with the point. Helpless little things."
The jab had caught Himmel's attention. The Poit's pointed ears twitched in mock offense.
"Oh yeah? Well, I bet it's a squad of Carlake, begging for supplies again. Such small brains can't comprehend how much food or water they'll need to keep up with humans,"
he said while he turned his attention back to his uniform. He knew his Carlake companion was joking, of course, but he couldn't help but chide back.
"Perhaps."
Zetrin hissed a laugh, and his long, broad tail slapped against the metal flooring. The Carlake turned his head towards Frairen in a silent request for her input. "As long as it's not any Yorpul embarrassing our race, then I'll be happy. But," Frairen grinned toothily at her companions, "the loser buys dinner the next time we dock for a resupply." She chided along with them. The back and forth so far managed to get a chuckle out of Frairen, and Himmel and Zetrin met her reply with chuckles or chortles of their own as they nodded along. The alarm and repeated message were becoming unbearable for Frairen's sensitive ears, so the trio shuffled off quickly to the hangar after their bet was finalised. The hangar for a human ship was impressively built. Humans may not have had the resources on their planet to mass-produce battleships of a huge scale, but their designers were brilliant and more than capable of working with the Opticon to fulfill their vision. The hangar was large, with multiple small, agile skirmisher ships docked within while having more than enough room to accommodate the constant hustle and bustle of the humans and star citizens within. Robotic arms slid down well-oiled rails on the walls and ceilings to manipulate the ships, to refuel them, take them apart, or hold them up for humans to work on. Besides Frairen's company, she could see more humans and star citizens attending to their tasks. A few of them glanced towards her, and the smattering of Yorpal, Poit, Carlake, and humans made up her company. But they know better than to linger for long. As the entirety of the third company arrived at the hangar, the alarm finally silenced itself, and Sergeant Killjoy took point in front of the crowd. The human wore a shallow grin despite the screaming of the alarms earlier. Frairen was convinced that he revelled in the pain of those around him. Not enough to lose her respect, though. "Here's the deal, my minions. An Optican ship, Broadfeather, has been attacked on the fringes of the war wave. Since we're the closest ally ship, you'll be sent to investigate, intervene, and extract any wounded Optican." A small circular drone hovered by Sergeant Killjoy's shoulder as he explained, and it promptly projected a map of the stars. It showed the long line of ships tasked with keeping the Mandarin forces at bay. 2 flags appeared on the projection as well, one for the Broadfeather and one for the Big Mouth Bass, nearly on the edge of the massive fleet known as the War Wave. The flags were red and orange, but some of the star citizens saw them more like murky browns or darker greens. It was enough to differentiate, at least, and, thankfully, the names on the map alleviated any confusion. "We aren't sure exactly what happened to them, so be cautious. The last message received from them was an automated distress signal." Killjoy waited for a shout of confirmation from the crowd before he continued. "You'll be taking the memory of Ahab, but we won't leave you high and dry. The Big Mouth Bass will be right behind you." He tacked on with a somewhat worrying smile. That was just Killjoy. Sergeant Killjoy, a smiling terror among fresh recruits. Frairen remembered those days, and sometimes her dreams would be haunted by that smile. "A distress signal isn't something to take lightly. The memory of Ahab has an armory, but I'm not letting anyone into the field in their Sunday best. Change and meet back here in 10. Captain Shawness's voice cut over the low chatter of the crowd. He stood straight as an arrow in front of everyone. Unlike Sergeant Killjoy, Shawness didn't present a carefree attitude. The company followed his order without complaint, moving like a well-oiled machine back to their dorms.
"So, who wins?"
Zetran asked, tilting his head down to look at his companions while they hustled to their dorm. "I think we'll all have to chip in," Frairen replied with a flat look pointed at her Carlake companion. This wasn't the best time to mention or possibly discuss another bet, and bad examples could lead to poor coordination. Something they definitely didn't need right now. Something else was on her mind, though. "What I'm more worried about is why the ship only sent an automated message. The Mandarin aren't known for their stealth operations, and Intel hasn't told us about any new allies of theirs."
"The ship was on the edge of the wave. It could have been a hit and run. They may not be known for their stealth, but they can hit like boulders, right?"
Himmel chimed in as he carefully looked up at the taller Yorpal and Carlake.
"They can. It's not their preferred tactic, though,"
Zetran replied.
Right. Let's save it for when we get there, though. We'll find out plenty then,"
Frairen said with a tentative nod. She didn't want to jump to conclusions. Himmel's lips parted to speak again, but Frairen quickly quieted him with a simple look. All that was left to focus on was jogging back to their dorm, but that, unfortunately, leaves her with her thoughts. The Mandarin weren't known for stealth or hit-and-run tactics. Strategy was a foreign word to most of them in general, especially considering their last engagements. The Mandarin had become desperate, uncoordinated, and brutish. They threw their bodies at the human war wave in hopes of finding a crack, but the war wave held strong, of course. The Mandarins became punching bags for human bloodlust, but an Optican ship being attacked and possibly destroyed so fast was a far cry from the desperate tactics they were using before. With how recent the attack was, Intel wouldn't be able to tell them anything aside from educated guesses. Really, they'd become the Intel this time. While the third company was battle-trained, beefy and combat-tested, soldiers are soldiers. Thinking was on the back burner when heading to assumed enemy territory, and stealth was hard in the combat gear. The humans wouldn't send them on this mission if they weren't entirely confident in needing the third company to do it, though. Right on time, the company shuffled into the bridge of the memory of Ahab quickly as the pilots moved to the cockpit. Captain Shaughness directed the company to lock themselves into the many seats lining the walls of the circular bridge as the ship's engines roared to life. Frairen heard the massive door of the hangar open over the roar of the engines at the back of the ship and on the wings. She also heard faint sounds of shouts telling everyone to vacate the area, shortly followed by the hurried stomps of many feet. The jets in the wings of the ship whined, and the metal plates used to rotate it groaned as they shifted. Was this a new ship? Or was it the oldest hunk of junk in the galaxy? Frairen wasn't necessarily worried, but she couldn't help but wonder. Unlike her human companions, she does still have a survival instinct, and it doesn't like when her ships whine and groan like newborn pups. Her humans seemed unconcerned, though, as the ship lifted off and brought a sudden feeling of weightlessness to the crew inside. Thankfully, it wasn't an alien feeling. Frairen's stomach actually settled as the ship hovered in the hangar. The engines gave one more burst of life before blasting out of the battleship and soaring into the stars. Frairen could see why Shaughness told them to strap in. The ship is going fast. Too fast. So fast that it felt like Frairen's fur was about to be ripped off, and the long necks of the Carlakes on board drifted towards the back of the ship. There was a brief moment of turbulence as the Ahab's memory escaped the artificial atmosphere of the battleship, but it was somehow just as shaky outside. Frairen's teeth ground together as the rumbling intensified. She'd had half the mind to curse out, "Who built this scrap heap?" But she couldn't, even if she wanted to. The bridge was filled by the collective groans of her company until everything suddenly jerked to a stop. It was calm, and the air was filled by a cacophony of the star citizens on board trying to catch their breath. Frairen's keen ears picked up another distinct sound, though. Laughter. She looked up to see where it was coming from, and she saw the humans wearing wide, toothy grins. Of course they're elated. Maybe Frairen does regret hanging around these death beasts for as long as she had. But it was also thanks to them that she could shake off the whiplash as fast as she could. Himmel wasn't so fortunate, though. Even if the star citizens are used to space travel, this is a different kind, and it didn't help that poits are small things. There wasn't a lot of space for their organs to shake around in. Frairen unfastened herself and reached over to Himmel.
"Deep breaths, Himmel. Deep breaths,"
she said calmly.
"I keep thinking humans can't get any more deranged, and they still manage to surprise me."
Himmel wheezed with a soft chuckle. He huffed a few times and wiped his brow. One of the humans strode up to the two with a smaller smile than the rest. She refrained from baring her teeth at them. Specialist Rayburn, a small human woman that Frairen witnessed turned feral on a dime in battle. Small and spicy. Frairen couldn't help the small sway of her tail as her friend approached. "Everything good, spaceman?" Rayburn asked as she came over and patted Himmel on the head. Frairen could see some of the other humans either checking on or teasing their own star citizen companions.
Never better. My favorite thing is putting my brain in a blender,
He replied with an undertone of playful sarcasm.
What even is this thing?
Frairen curiously looked over to Rayburn as well. "It's a human original to my knowledge. I think it's a refurbished skirmisher from when we made them on Earth, but I'm not sure why the higher-ups decided to bring it back," Rayburn explained. She helped Himmel slowly unfasten himself and stand. She made sure to hold him steady as he swayed on his feet. Himmel leaned heavily against Specialist Rayburn, something she and Frairen found amusing. He moved like he was drunk again. "You all right, Short Stack?" she asked, and Himmel's grateful murmurs turned into apprehensive yet reassuring grumbles. If he was coordinated enough to get sour, then he was coordinated enough not to pass out. Great. What was not as great was the confirmation that the memory of Ahab was really an old bucket of bolts. Frairen couldn't help but mentally pray to Tyr that the ship held long enough for them to get back. Not that she lacked faith in human craftsmanship, but this ship seemed like an experiment. The main thing that kept Frairen encouraged was that the humans didn't seem bothered. Though their human magic might have just kicked in at the prospect of fiery death. Captain Shaw caught Frairen's attention out of the corner of her eye. He pressed against his earpiece with a sour expression, and then he approached her. "Corporal Frairen, come with me to the cockpit." She followed obediently, of course. The cockpit itself was nestled between two metal prongs that extended far ahead on the front of the ship. From what Frairen could see, what she couldn't see really, they just served to be massive blind spots. There were no signs of rail cannons or energy weapons or even the kinetic weapons humans preferred to use. Maybe the prongs were just for flair, an intimidation tactic? Frairen didn't have much time to dwell on it as the ship turned to the wreck of the ship they'd been hunting for. The cockpit fell deathly silent. Even the small beeps that notified the pilots of the ship's vitals faded into the background and the back of Frairen's mind as she looked at the scene ahead. The broad feather wasn't broad anymore. The Opticon's fine craftsmanship had been reduced to a wreck floating in space. The ship was cut in half entirely. Frairen could easily tell it wasn't a clean cut even from so far away. The pilots quietly pulled up a separate screen on the glass which provided a more detailed view of the wreck. The metal was ripped outwards but inwards towards the centre of the ship. Frairen had never seen anything like it. But she did recognise crystals. A telltale sign of Mandarin munitions. Shaunus didn't take his eyes off the wreck as he started giving out orders again. "You and I will go first. You'll lead a unit of Yorpals, and I'll bring humans to pair with them. The others will set up a perimeter and guard our ship." He finally tore his gaze away from the sight. "Go get your unit, and I'll go get the others up to speed." Frairen nodded with a small huff in response. Her words died in her throat as she turned around to head to the brig. The silence followed her back into the circular room. The good-hearted jabs and teasing between human and star citizen had quieted down as everyone's focus drew to the now opened windows. They couldn't help but stare. Frairen didn't blame them either. A call to investigate a simple attack had turned much more serious. Sure, they would respond seriously to any attack, but the third company had fairly easily handled the Mandarines before. This was a grim reminder of what the Mandarines were capable of. Some of the members of Frairen's company weren't fazed. They didn't show it at least, but they could have also seen worse, especially those with experience. Frairen couldn't afford to let it bother her. Even if the odds were slim, she had to hurry for any possible survivor on board, so she barked for her fellow Yorpal to follow her to the armory. It took them a few moments to peel away from the windows, but they eventually followed her, stealing glances at the wreck. She heard Shaunus walk into the brig and grab the attention of the rest of the company with the swift order of, "Attention!" The sound of boots falling into their trained stances swiftly followed the order while the Yorpal disappeared into the armory. The first ones out were the Yorpal. The drop bay doors shuttered open for them, very reassuring, and Frairen ushered them into space. The suits on board were updated at least. Frairen could actually recognise what time period they were made in, and they didn't creak as the Yorpal glided through space. Captain Shaunus and his humans dropped into space behind them and followed closely towards the wreck. The Carlakes didn't follow as closely. They slowly started building a perimeter around the wreck, and the Poits stayed behind to guard the memory of Ahab. For now, they needed scouts. As the group descended on the wreck, their boots glowed and magnetized to the broken hull. The first thing they saw were the remains of the engine towards the center of the ship. It was split in half like the rest, but long strips of metal were drawn to it along with iridescent liquid floating between the bent halves of the engine. The scouting party could see crystals as well, the trace of the Mandarine munitions that the entire party was familiar with. Those crystals hurt like a bitch, and Frairen hoped that whoever was unfortunate enough to get hit by them at least died quickly.
Keep your comms open, but split up and search the ship. Take a human partner with you,
she said as she nodded towards the mixed squad of human and Yorpal. Shaunus glanced back at his humans and motioned for them to move ahead and find their Yorpal. Normally, Yorpal wouldn't be thrilled with what amounted to human guard dogs, but they've been trained vigorously enough for them to swallow their pride. It wasn't wise to venture on one's own here. Captain Shaunus moved to Frairen's side and put a hand on her shoulder. She didn't really need the reassurance, but knowing that a human had her back was still nice. The group split. Shaunus and Frairen dove into the divide of the wreck to do broad sweeps of the inner compartments, and the other groups floated off to the sides of the ship to search for any compartments that weren't cut in half or exploded. None of the windows survived the attack. The dull colour of blood was scattered throughout every room, dragged across the ground, dotted on the walls, climbing through window frames, on desks and chairs and beds and computers. Everywhere. Crystals were scattered similarly around the broken ship. Not a single inch of the wreck was left untouched by crystals, blood, or bone fragments. It was like the Mandarine purposely gave the Broadfeather a new paint job, but there were no traces of corpses. Perhaps they'd been taken back to wherever the Mandarine called home to be sacrificed. Frairen shuddered at the thought, and she prayed that those poor souls were long dead before they were taken away. It wasn't enough for her or Captain Shaunus to falter in their search, though. Despite the loud and obnoxious nature of the Mandarines on the battlefield, Frairen and the other Yorpal couldn't manage to find a lead to follow. But Frairen noticed something strange about Captain Shaunus as they paused in a common room. She could see him looking strangely through the space around them. To be honest, she'd noticed it long before they arrived here. She just chose not to comment on his peculiar way of searching.
Notice something?
She finally asked.
You haven't?
He replied as he inspected some of the bloodstains, though he turned his head towards her with a raised brow.
I have not.
Frairen replied as she glided over to the bloodstain Shaunus was inspecting.
What do you see?
She contained her snark. Now wasn't the time, nor was Captain Shaunus the person to be snarky with.
There's smoke, Corporal. Red smoke. I've seen it throughout the ship, but I didn't think it was anything of note until I realized where it was coming from.
Captain Shaunus straightened up, and he reached his hand out into the empty space, waving his fingers in the air like a madman. After a moment of wiggling his fingers, Captain Shaunus pointed to a few more areas, the crystals and the blood. He followed an invisible trail that came from those sources and funneled out into the center split in the middle of the wreck. Frairen tilted her head. Maybe Shaunus had gone space mad, but she suddenly started to see what he meant. In the empty space was a dull, wispy trail. To her, it was almost grey, though she could tell it matched the crystals. She could see it trailing everywhere throughout the wreck, coalescing in the split center and shooting out to space. The other pairs apparently came to the same conclusion as they slowly regrouped with Frairen and Captain Shaunus. The group exchanged glances and Shaunus broke the silence over the comms.
It's not a great lead, but at least we have one. We'll return to the ship and follow the trail. I'll let the big mouth bass know to follow us beyond the wreck.
He motioned for the scouting party to return to the memory of Ahab, and they followed diligently, making sure to call back their Carlake allies as well. The third company met in their ship once more. They mingled quietly as they passed by the wreck and ventured further into space. A few of the crew took off their hats or put their hands over their hearts to pay their respects. Another mark the humans left on the star citizens that joined them long ago. Space was empty. Naturally. The human pilots could keep track of the red trail much easier than any star citizen on board, even though the star citizens did try. Captain Shaunus ordered every soldier into their combat gear. They'd need to be ready considering that they're more than likely heading into hostile territory. Everyone could comfortably switch into their combat gear thanks to the decreased speed of the ship. To track the mist, the trip had to take a lot longer, and the pilots didn't want to outrun the big mouth bass by too much anyway. There weren't any signs of the Mandarin as the two ships slowly pulled from the war wave, but they could begin to tell what direction they were going. Instead of facing the wave head-on, these Mandarins had apparently decided to travel further to the side of it. Dead or uninhabitable planets passed the Ahab's windows as they drifted by, but scanners didn't pick up any signs of life. The crew was kept busy by each other as they waited for anything to pull the trigger on their instinct to fight, yet nothing came. Not until they were hit. The memory of Ahab took the blast of energy surprisingly well, but it made the old ship rattle and groan as it kept itself together. The crew braced themselves on tables or chairs or walls, whatever they could get their hands on, and another shot followed shortly after the first. The ship rattled again, and the tip of one of the wings was blasted off. It was difficult to tell where these shots were actually coming from. There was no ship in sight, and no gleam from nearby planets to indicate planetary fire. That was until a portal opened in front of the window, and a blast of energy shot through it. The pilots were able to swerve in time to avoid the window being shot out, thank Tyr, but the maneuver rattled the crew inside.
Brace yourselves! Strap into your seats again if you can!
Captain Shaunus boomed over the sound of rattling metal and more alarms screaming throughout the ship. Some of the company made it. Humans and Carlake helped their smaller companions into the seats, but the evasive actions of the pilots, Even if they were saving them, we're also making them tumble in the ship like rocks. The blasts of energy grew in frequency the further the pilots pressed in the direction they were heading, and shots came from every direction. They came from the front, the sides, the back, and below the ship as if they were hurting it. As if they were hurting it. Frairen strapped herself and Himmel to a chair. During the turmoil, she glanced out of the window to see a ship in the distance beyond the portals erratically opening around them. A ship like a mountain and as hard as stone. She saw dull beams shooting off it and into portals that opened around it. They were the same beams that were threatening to turn them into space debris. The memory of Ahab soared through space like a ship in turbulent waves. Every time it turned to retreat to the big mouth bass, a shot veered it off course. Every time it evaded one shot, another quickly took its place. And every time it was hit by a blast, it slowed down more and more. They were really trying to herd them. As the large Mandarin battleship drew closer, Frairen had one thought. Not one of panic, but one of,
Are these assholes crazy?
maybe they were desperate if they were trying to herd death welders right to their front doorstep. Humans have been beating them down ever since they tried to take over trade lines and sovereign worlds. The Sindiral Federation was desperate to recruit humans for a reason. A reason that would be soon to come to fruition with a simple order from Captain Shaunus. If the memory of Ahab couldn't retreat, it would
Do what this ship is made for!
Shaunus fiercely shouted towards the pilots. That order was immediately followed. The ship lurched again as it picked up speed. The engines roared so loud that Frairen's ears began ringing and the temperature in the ship rose sharply. Ahab found a new burst of speed. What sounded like lightning crackled towards the front of the ship. Those within could see the prongs in front become electrified as the ship steered sharply towards one of the portals. It rolled out of the way of the blast that came through, stabilized, and dove into the portal. Maybe some normal species would have proceeded with caution, but human magic propelled the memory of Ahab forward unabated. Travelling through the portal sucked bowls, almost as unpleasant as breaching into space the first time on this bucket of bolts. Migraine-inducing light flooded into the brig and washed over each member of the company within. And something gurgled and screamed outside like an overly hot knife through butter. However, a familiar commanding voice spoke over it all.
The enemy uses nothing but cheap tricks to try and take us down,
Captain Shaunus shouted and stomped his foot.
We'll show him that it'll take more than a strobe light to trip us up.
Another shout, another stomp. This time more stomps followed. Other members of the company met Shaunus's grounding gesture with their own.
Hold yourselves together and prepare to kill!
Everyone stomped with Shaunus this time.
Iron and steel!
He shouted. His shout was met by howls and hollers in response. To say his short speech was energizing would be an understatement. With a few words, the company once blinded by light had turned into a cage of rabid animals shouting and stomping and bracing themselves for battle. The light suddenly left the ship, and Frairen saw what awaited them. The memory of Ahab was pointed straight at the Mandarin battleship, and the human pilots didn't hesitate in harpooning the prongs into the earthly flesh of the opposing vessel. The company lurched and groaned again, but they recovered quickly. Their shock faded into bloodlust as Shaunus practically snapped his harness off and ran towards the cockpit. The company rushed similarly after him, and they diligently funneled into the now open doors leading to the prongs plunged deep into the Mandarin ship. A deep growl vibrated in Frairen's throat as she almost clawed up her own harness and joined her company in battle. She fell near the back, as did Himmel, while Zetrin split into the right side prong towards the front without them. They went left. The soldiers ahead of them muscled through the claustrophobic metal hallways, and they were met with surprisingly fast counterattack. The Mandarin had broken into the prongs and raised their much larger weapons at the humans trying to flow into the ship, but they were simply too late. A tall-skinned human, Marcus, had already buried the clawed part of his slammer into the head of the first Mandarin within the tunnel. He took the both of them down to the ground as the humans behind him got into position. The humans in front knelt down while the others remained standing, and they all opened fire on the other Mandarin drones that were foolish enough to follow their unfortunate predecessor. Frairen caught the faint sounds of gunfire from the other prong, as well as the Mandarins shouting to not fall so easily to their doom. That was also unlike them. Mandarins live for battle, and considering the lack of bodies hitting the floor on her prong, they had obeyed. There were a lot of them. That much was clear by the sheer amount of heavy footsteps forming a line outside of the crude outline they'd cut out of the prong. Marcus halted the line behind him. He pulled out a staple weapon for the humans, the 40mm grenade launcher. Once the stomps outside quieted down, he quickly peeked out and fired a grenade into the wall of meat that stood before them. He fired one, then another, and one more after that before ducking into the hallway to avoid the crystal round shot at his head. Once the wall of Mandarins had been broken, Marcus signalled for the squad behind him to move in once more, and Frairen flooded into the Mandarin ship alongside the humans, Poits, Carlakes, and the other Yorpals of the Third Company. She saw bits of Mandarin flesh and blood explode across the walls of the ship's once dark grey hallway. Any whole Mandarin laying disorientated on the ground was quickly checked and dispatched by combat knives, slammers, or rifles. Himmel pulled alongside Frairen. Good thing she did too. As Himmel rounded the corner of their hallway, a Mandarin melee specialist did as well. The large male Mandarin tried to slam his warhammer down on Himmel, but Frairen quickly intercepted. She hooked the Mandarin's warhammer with the claw of her slammer and used the rockets within to propel her upswing that knocked the head of the Mandarin clear off. Once Himmel was able to round the corner completely, he launched a slew of grenades down at the Mandarins approaching the hallway they had breached. The Third Company burned through the Mandarin ship like a controlled flame in a dry field. The more experienced members led the charge or supported the less experienced members. For every 10 Mandarins slain, the Third Company sustained 2 injuries. It was more familiar to Frairen tearing through the Mandarin with coordination that they simply couldn't stand up to. What was strange was the chase. Mandarins retreated further towards the centre of the ship. They seemed to take cover and choose their battles more carefully, which was almost worrying. And she soon learned why. The handful of remaining Mandarins Frairen's group had been chasing suddenly veered into a dark room. The walls almost appeared stone-like, and there were cylinders circling dull runes scraped into the ground. One Mandarin stood tall above the normally 6-foot-tall Mandarins. Instead of darker black skin, he had a dark purple. His ears were elongated much further than a normal Mandarin, and his eyes had a pinkish hue. However, his most striking feature was feathers adorning his neck, shoulders, and biceps. They weren't decorations like the necklaces of bones, fingers, or ears. They were embedded, growing from his skin. Even his nose seemed more pointed. He stood in a console of stone-like metal surrounded by the runes, and the smaller Mandarins filed into circles the runes outlined around the console. The large Mandarin stared at Frairen and a few of her group as they halted at the sight of the beast, and he looked bored. Anger simmered beneath his skin, but he barely showed any reaction to the blood-stained Yorpals, humans, and Carlake that stumbled into the room.
Troublesome Kozbek,
the large one growled as he typed away at the console. With one stroke of his hand, the runes began to glow fiercely. A flush of heat flooded the room, and that gurgling screech assaulted Frairen's ears unfiltered. The pressure of the room coiled like a spring, and Frairen's instinct screamed at her to turn back, which she did. She pulled as many of her comrades with her as she could around the doorway and down to the ground before the mandarin disappeared in a flash and left an unearthly explosion behind them. The blast seared Frairen's fur and launched her and her comrades flying against the opposite wall. Crystals littered her armor, piercing through and prickling the flesh underneath. Others weren't as lucky to take cover, but Frairen's vision swam too much to comprehend who had gotten hit and how badly they were wounded. Her vision swam, ears stung, and flesh ached. She couldn't possibly keep track of how long her eyes were shut until she was jolted awake by a needle being embedded into her thigh. It shot life back into her, sure, but it also made her want to tear the throat out of whoever just stuck her. Specialist Rayburn's firm but sincere touch held the panicked Yorpal down quickly.
Easy, furry. You're all right now.
Rayburn assured her as she patted her friend's chest. Frairen wasn't in the Mandarin ship anymore. She took deep breaths as she glanced around her new surroundings. It was the med bay aboard the Big Mouth Bass, home to many at this point. Frairen's quick glance was enough for her to see a good chunk of the third company in sickbeds with various injuries. Some had their limbs hoisted by cloth hammocks, others bags of blood attached to them, and others simply sat by the sides of the more wounded. The delirious Frairen instinctively did a head count. No one had died, thank Tyr, but the blast had left its mark at least. The bad part was that she couldn't exactly make out who had what injury or how severe that injury was. She could see some. 2 patients next to her were humans that were burnt in the blast. Their arms and legs bore the mark of the blast, but it would heal. Humans always healed. Frairen was more concerned for her Carlake and Poit companion, yet they weren't in her very limited field of view. Zetrin was a hardy thing. She was sure that he would have withstood the blast, but Himmel was another story. At least he wasn't face first in it like Frairen. They're probably fine. Frairen would take a couple of deep breaths, but her lungs forced her to cough before filling with air.
What?
Frairen was interrupted by a cough.
Happened?
Frairen asked as her gaze slowly settled on Rayburn. A handful of other coughs tickled the back of her throat, but she refused to let them out.
A lot. There were apparently 2 mutated Mandarin troops that nearly blew up half of our boys. That ship has been practically cleaned out, but whatever they used to get away was destroyed with their escape. And after some more digging, the remaining members of the company found this.
Rayburn said, her usual soft smile twisted down into a frown. She sighed and pulled a holopad off the bedside table. Frairen looked at the image displayed on the outstretched holopad. The first thing she saw was bodies. The bodies of the bird-like Opticon crew. Their bodies were laid on tables and their entrails led to a glass and metal container in the centre of the room. Frairen saw runes carved into the ground, stained with blood and lined with organs, and glass tubes above those runes fed into a cylindrical container in the centre. There was a video as well. In a steady rhythm, the organs were sucked through the tubes and further into the container in the middle. That cylinder churned with meat, flesh, and bone. The video was short, but long enough to make Frairen's own stomach churn. The last image made her heart drop, though. The container had been stopped. Meat and bone stopped churning, and whatever concoction was inside the container had been carefully cut open. Frairen would have never believed what was inside if she hadn't seen it with her own eyes. It had dark purple skin, long ears, and pinkish eyes like the mutated mandarin. It even had the beginnings of feathers, but it was much different. Curled within the flesh of Opticon was a fetus, breathing and crying.